Rain hammered the streets like an angry drum, turning the city into a maze of shadows and murmurs. Behind the cracked windows of a worn apartment building, he sat alone, heart thundering, listening to whispers that weren't meant for him. Faces passed by, smiling, blind to the eyes that followed them. Every step on the wet pavement echoed a warning. Every glance felt like judgment. He had always known the world wasn't built for people like him. Every gesture, every word of dismissal, had left its mark, invisible yet burning under his skin. Tonight, it all felt heavier. The air smelled of fear and rain and something else, something that whispered of danger lurking in plain sight. Somewhere close, laughter pierced the dark. Not the light laughter of joy, but the cruel, hollow sound that mocked, that reminded him of every time he had been unseen, unheard, treated as less. He clenched his fists, feeling the old familiar rage simmer, ready to ignite. The city lights flickered, a sudden blackout plunging the street into darkness. In that pause, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a choice, a moment where everything could change. And in the quiet before chaos, he realized that tonight would not end like all the others. Tonight, something hidden, long ignored, would surface. And as the first siren wailed in the distance, echoing like a call to reckoning, a thought cut sharper than the cold wind. They had underestimated him. They had no idea what was coming. Hit subscribe. Watch till the end. The first light of dawn filtered through the slats of his apartment blinds, casting fractured shadows on the cracked floorboards. Outside, the neighborhood awoke with a faint hum, cars sputtering to life, doors slamming, the scent of wet asphalt lingering from last night's storm. He moved silently, a figure etched in quiet determination, a man carrying the weight of countless invisible battles. From a young age, he had understood the unspoken rules of the streets. People judged before they listened, feared what they didn't understand, and assumed weakness in anyone who didn't match their expectations. Every encounter had left scars, some physical, many far deeper, invisible to the world but etched into his soul. His apartment was modest, walls lined with memories, faded photographs, trophies from a past life, scraps of notebooks filled with thoughts too dangerous to share. A single chair faced the window, and there he often sat, watching the rhythm of the streets, cataloging the patterns of life and cruelty alike. The city was a chessboard, and he had learned to anticipate every move, every sneer, every sideways glance, every whispered word meant to remind him of his place. Today was different. The air carried tension heavier than any morning he had known. The neighbors, oblivious, carried on, but he felt the shift, a subtle ripple in the current, like a warning under the surface. Across the street, a group gathered outside a corporate office building. Their laughter was sharp, predatory, cutting through the calm like knives. He knew them. They represented everything he had fought to ignore, the systemic weight pressing down on lives like his, the casual cruelty wrapped in suits and privilege. As he prepared to leave his apartment, his movements were deliberate. Every step measured. Every action a declaration that he would not be erased. Today, he would walk into the world armed with more than just resolve. He carried the knowledge of his own worth, and the quiet fire of someone who had seen injustice too many times to remain passive. The streets, wet from last night's rain, reflected neon signs and traffic lights, creating pools of distorted color that seemed almost alive. Shadows clung to corners and alleyways, hiding the stories of those who had disappeared quietly, whose voices had never been heard. He navigated this landscape with practiced caution, aware that every glance from a passerby could carry judgment, suspicion, or worse. At the heart of the city stood the building that had long symbolized the barrier between his life and the world's indifference. A sleek, glass tower where decisions were made that affected countless lives, including his own. He had been here before, unnoticed, dismissed, a ghost in the machinery of privilege. Today he would enter differently. Today he would be seen, not for the first time, but perhaps the last. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of burning rubber and rain-soaked pavement. Every step toward the tower was heavy with anticipation. Each heartbeat a drum echoing the injustice he had witnessed, the whispers of prejudice, the quiet indignities stacked one upon another. He felt the weight of his ancestors, the echoes of those who had fought before him, and the silent promise to those who would come after. As he approached the revolving doors, the reflections in the glass blurred the line between his own face and the distorted images of those inside. This was more than a building. It was a fortress of assumptions, a place where the world's hierarchy had written rules he was told he could never challenge. But the fire inside him refused to be snuffed out. He stepped forward, fully aware that the events about to unfold would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The glass doors of the towering office building closed behind him with a soft, almost accusatory click, separating him from the storm-washed streets. Inside, the sterile lights reflected off polished floors, the hum of air conditioning blending with muted conversations, the shuffle of expensive shoes that carried authority. He moved carefully, a shadow among the polished reflections, aware of the eyes that flickered toward him, subtle, dismissive, yet heavy with assumptions. Every step seemed to amplify the weight of unspoken judgments. People avoided his gaze, some smiled too widely, nervously, as if their civility depended on pretending he didn't exist. Each glance, each gesture, became a thread tightening the coil of tension around him. He had faced this before: the casual racism, the invisible barriers, the systemic dismissals. But today, he carried more than experience. He carried a silent resolve that would not bend under their scrutiny. At the reception, the clerk looked up with a polite smile that barely concealed skepticism. "Can I help you?" The words were innocuous, but the hesitation in their tone spoke volumes. He offered his name, his purpose, and noticed the subtle shift, the questions, the double checks, the whispered conversation behind a frosted glass panel. Every signal confirmed the truth he already knew. In this place, people like him were not expected to be seen, not expected to succeed, not expected to challenge the established order. The elevator ride was long, the mirrored walls reflecting not only his image but also the echoes of every microaggression he had endured over a lifetime. Each floor passed like a countdown, each ding a reminder that the moment of confrontation was approaching. He imagined the eyes above the glass walls of the corner offices, watching, judging, waiting for a misstep, a flaw to confirm their biases. When the doors opened, he stepped onto the executive floor, and the world seemed to tilt slightly. Men and women in tailored suits moved with authority, their laughter crisp, their discussions layered with exclusionary language, subtle references, and assumptions made without thought. Every movement around him reinforced the social hierarchy that had long been stacked against people like him. He felt it in his chest, a mixture of rage, sorrow, and determination, each emotion fueling the steps he took forward. Then it happened. A brief, almost imperceptible moment of injustice. A colleague, a senior figure, brushed past him, muttering a slight so subtle that most would have missed it. But he noticed, as he always did, the accumulation of these slights, the small, persistent forces that shaped a life of vigilance and quiet endurance. He paused, letting the weight of that single act settle like a stone in his gut, realizing that the battle ahead was not merely against individuals but against an entire system that thrived on invisibility and silence. Hours passed like minutes. Meetings were held, proposals discussed, decisions made, all under the surface. Tension simmered. He observed quietly, cataloging every interaction, every nuance, every reflection of bias. Conversations excluded him, assumptions questioned his competence, and jokes, thinly veiled with politeness, served as reminders of his perceived place. Yet he remained composed, each controlled breath a defiance, each measured step a testament to resilience forged in fire. By late afternoon, the weight of the day had intensified. A critical decision loomed, one that could affect countless lives, including his own. He watched as the powerful deliberated, their casual disregard for fairness and equity sharpening the edges of reality into something almost unbearable. He felt the pulse of injustice, felt it twist in his gut, and knew that the moment to act, to challenge, was nearing. Outside, the city had darkened, rain once again tapping against the glass, an echo of the tension that filled the room. Shadows pooled in corners, reflecting the stark contrast between the world inside the tower and the world outside. one of privilege, one of survival, one where bias dictated outcomes in ways invisible yet catastrophic. And in that moment, he understood fully that this was the crucible of his story, a collision of past scars, present challenges, and the inevitable reckoning to come. The final hours of the day approached. The tension in the room was almost tangible, a quiet storm of suppressed truths and unspoken hierarchies. Every glance, every sigh, every whisper could tip the balance. He felt the culmination of years of endurance, the weight of history pressing down, the silent demand for justice. And in that charged air, he prepared himself, knowing that the climax, the point where everything would be tested, was imminent. The room fell silent, as if the air itself held its breath. All the hidden tensions, the whispered prejudices, the countless slights, coalesced into one unbearable moment. Eyes that had casually dismissed him now widened in shock. Decisions that had seemed untouchable trembled under the weight of truth. He stepped forward, calm but unyielding, a presence that could no longer be ignored. The silence pressed in, heavy and oppressive, as every gaze fixed upon him, some incredulous, some fearful. Words he had rehearsed were unnecessary. The power of conviction, the certainty of experience, spoke louder than any argument. Documents, meetings, hierarchies, none could shield them from the reality they had ignored for so long. In a single, irreversible moment, the facade cracked. Systems built to marginalize and dismiss were exposed, vulnerabilities laid bare, the consequences of neglect and prejudice impossible to deny. Shock rippled across the room. The laughter, the casual superiority, the assumptions, all shattered by the undeniable force of presence and truth. For once, they felt what it was like to be powerless, watched, and confronted by a reality they had chosen to ignore. And as he turned away, leaving the room charged with the weight of revelation, one thought lingered. Change had begun, not because they chose it, but because it could no longer be avoided. The reckoning was complete. The tower felt different in the hours that followed. The air, once thick with judgment and invisible barriers, had shifted. Though no one admitted it aloud, a subtle acknowledgement lingered, a recognition that the world had just tilted, ever so slightly, toward accountability. He walked down the gleaming corridors, each step measured, aware of the eyes that followed him with a mix of unease and reluctant respect. It was a quiet victory, one built not on spectacle but on the undeniable weight of truth. Outside, the streets shimmered under a fading sunset, the rain leaving a slick reflection that made the city feel new, even if for only a moment. People passed by, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred behind the glass walls. To them, life continued in its predictable rhythm. Yet he knew better. He understood that change often began quietly, imperceptibly, with a single moment of courage that others might not see but would eventually feel. He returned to his apartment, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting him like an old friend. The solitude that once carried the weight of isolation now felt different, lighter, charged with purpose. Memories of every slight, every whisper, every dismissal that had once built invisible walls around him now seemed to fuel a new understanding. These walls had not imprisoned him, they had shaped him, sharpened him, and prepared him for this very moment. In the following days, ripples of the confrontation spread outward, subtle but undeniable. Policies were re-examined, meetings approached with greater caution, and whispers of accountability replaced the casual dismissals of before. He watched, detached but attentive, as the world he had navigated so carefully began to shift, not entirely, not perfectly, but enough to mark a beginning. Change, he realized, was less about instant transformation and more about planting seeds in soil long neglected. The community around him started to notice differences in small ways. Colleagues who had once been distant now lingered in conversation, listening rather than assuming. Decisions that had previously excluded voices like his were reconsidered. And though he remained vigilant, aware that true justice required persistence beyond a single confrontation, he also recognized the quiet satisfaction of having made the invisible visible. Evenings were still filled with reflection, but the weight had shifted from anger to clarity. He thought of the countless others who had been dismissed, ignored, and silenced, imagining the courage it might take for them to step forward in their own lives. The story he had lived, the confrontation he had endured, was no longer solely his own. It belonged to anyone who had felt the sting of prejudice, anyone who had ever been made to feel smaller than they were. And yet, there was no sense of triumphalism in him. Victory had never been about punishment or revenge. It had been about presence, about resilience, about asserting a truth that could not be erased. In a world that often sought to make him invisible, he had refused to vanish. That refusal, simple and profound, had begun a ripple that would extend far beyond the walls of the office, the city, and the street where it all unfolded. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city was still and the rain whispered against the windows, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The injustice had been real, raw, and undeniable, but so was the power of endurance. The experience had left scars, but it had also illuminated a path forward, one where visibility, courage, and integrity could challenge even the most entrenched systems. And as he looked out over the streets now bathed in the pale light of early morning, he realized something crucial. The fight against prejudice was never a single moment. It was a series of steps, choices, and actions, each small yet cumulative. Each assertion of self, each refusal to be dismissed, each confrontation with bias, contributed to a broader reckoning, one that could eventually shift the world in ways unimaginable to those who had built it to exclude. He understood, too, that stories mattered. The story he had just lived, the confrontation, the challenge, the unyielding presence of a single individual, would inspire others in ways he could not yet measure. It was a reminder that courage was contagious, that witnessing justice could empower even the silent, and that the weight of systemic oppression could be challenged, if only by refusing to be invisible. As the sun rose fully over the city, casting gold across streets that had once felt indifferent and cold, he took a deep breath. The battle was ongoing, and the world remained imperfect. But within him, there was a sense of clarity, a recognition that his actions had shifted something fundamental. He had transformed fear into resolve, invisibility into presence, and injustice into a catalyst for change. And in that recognition, a final thought settled with quiet power: how many more would see the truth and step forward? How many more would refuse to remain silent, to accept diminishment, to allow the world to define their worth? Change had begun, not in grand proclamations, but in the undeniable courage of one who refused to vanish. The city moved on, as it always did, but something in the rhythm had changed. The echo of truth lingered, subtle but persistent, like the hum of rain on asphalt, like the pulse of courage in those who dared to confront what had long been ignored. And in that echo, the story remained, an enduring testament to resilience, presence, and the quiet, relentless power of justice.